This is part 4 of the lecture on individualized education programs, the IEP. My name is Dr. George Giuliani from Hofstra University, and we have been discussing the required components of an IEP, and we've been through the first 6 required components, and now we'll go to the 7th required component of an IEP. The IEP must contain the date the related services and modifications will begin, as well as the expected frequency, location, and duration of the services. This component of the IEP is pretty straightforward. The IEP has to indicate the date on which it becomes effective and how long it lasts. So again, the IEP has to contain the date the related services and modifications will begin, how often, the location, the duration, and unless otherwise stated in the IEP, all services continue until the end of the school year to be reevaluated at the student's annual review. So when you pick up an IEP and there are various related services and it doesn't say how long, for whatever reason it doesn't say how long, it is assumed to be for one school year. Everything on an IEP is assumed to be for one school year unless otherwise noted. So this section of the IEP is where the details are specified about the services that a child with a disability will receive. The when, the where, how often, how long of service delivery. And the service delivery statement in the IEP should include how often the child will receive the services, so the number of times per day or the number of times per week. So for instance, speech language therapy twice a week. How long each session will be, so speech language therapy twice a week for 40 minutes each session. Where the services will be provided, so will the speech language therapy occur in a general ed classroom, in a special ed room, in the speech language therapist's office, and when the services will begin and when the services will end, in a sense, the starting and ending dates. And as I mentioned, if there are no start or end dates, it is assumed for one school year. So this component of the IEP is really very, very cut and dry, very straightforward. It tells us how often, how long, where, and when. The 8th component or required component of the IEP is as follows. Beginning not later than when the first IEP is in effect for a child who turns 16 or younger if appropriate, the IEP must contain a statement of needed transition services. Transition services. So the 8th required component of the IEP is known as the transition services statement. Now, if you're watching this in New York State, if you're a Hofstra student in New York State, the age that a statement of the needed transition services must be addressed in the IEP is actually 15 years of age. So the federal law says it has to be by 16, but in New York State, it actually has to be by 15 years of age. So this is about transition services. And what are transition services? Transition services are services that assist the adolescent with a disability to successfully move from school to post-school activities. The transition plan provides the framework for identifying, planning, and carrying out activities that will help a student make a successful transition to adult life, whether that's employment, housing, social networks, after leaving school. So let's just talk about this and let's just think about what this is all about. When the federal law, Public Law 94-142, first came into effect in 1975, it was our nation's first special education law. And the law had many different components which were wonderful. It worked out great. But one of the problems was that upon graduation, we said to these students with disabilities, good luck, all the best. And we didn't have a plan for them. There was nothing to transition them from school to when they get out of school. So in 1990, when we reauthorized the federal law to IDEA, and go back to the history on special ed if you don't remember that, and we changed the name to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in 1990, we add transition services to the federal law. We talk about the idea that we have to have a plan in place that will provide the framework for helping students go from school to post-school activities, and this is known as transition services. Now, transition services on an IEP could include many things. For example, college exploration. Does this student with a disability want to go to college after high school? Career exploration. Does the student want to get a job? How about participation in a vocational preparation program, preparing them in high school for a particular vocation, giving them training in certain skills such as keeping budgets or writing checks, independent living, helping these students with disabilities move out of their parents' home and into their own independent housing, work experience, or any other service or activity related to a student's post-school plans. So when you think about transition services, I want you to think about the idea of this is for adolescents, and adolescents who will be transitioning from school to post-school after they graduate. So you're not going to see transition services on an IEP for someone who's 7 years old or 8 years old, but you will see it starting around 14, 15, and absolutely mandated by 16 years of age. Again, by 16, there must be a transition plan in the federal law. And again, if you're in New York, it must be by 15. It could be earlier in certain school districts, but in New York, has to be by 15 years old. And by the federal law throughout the country, must be by 16 years of age. And again, this transition services plan is very important because it's going to help the student go from school to post-school activities. For the students themselves, the outcome or results sought via coordinated transition activities must be personally defined. Again, so transition services is personal to the student. It has to take into account the student's interests, preferences, needs, and strengths. And that's why the school district, the local education agency, or LEA, the school district must invite the child with a disability to attend the IEP meeting if a purpose of the meeting will be the consideration of the post-secondary goals for the student and the transition services needed to assist him or her in reaching those goals. And think about it, that makes a lot of sense. If you're going to have a meeting on transition services for a student, you're going to have a meeting on what's going to happen to this student after this student graduates from high school, we have to be sure that that student is there at the meeting, or at least we invite the student to the meeting to discuss the issues at hand. And if the student is not able to attend or doesn't attend, then the school district must take other steps to ensure that the child's preferences and interests are considered in some way. So it's very important that we try as best as we can as school districts to be sure that the students' needs are being met, that the students' wishes are being looked at and addressed, and that's why we need to invite the student with a disability to his or her transition plan meeting. The ninth required component of the IEP states that the IEP must also contain a statement 1 year before a student reaches the age of majority that the student has been informed of his or her rights, which will transfer to the student at the age of majority. Okay, so what are we talking about here? All right, we're talking about when the student legally becomes an adult. So state law determines whether and at what age the rights transfer of someone. When does the child legally become an adult? And again, if you're watching this in New York State, if you're a Hofstra student, in New York State, 18 years of age is when a person is considered the age of majority, legally becoming an adult. So the IEP has to contain a statement 1 year before a student reaches the age of majority. So at 17, right? Because if the age of majority is 18, the IEP must contain a statement 1 year before the student reaches the age of majority. And the student has been informed of his or her rights, which will transfer to the student at the age of majority. At 18 years old, your rights transfer from your parents to you. Now, the federal law doesn't specify the manner in which schools must inform the children of how these rights will transfer to them upon reaching the age of majority. So IDEA doesn't say this is how you have to tell the student, this is the form you need to send to them, this is what you need to do. IDEA just says make sure 1 year before the student reaches that age of majority that the student has been informed of his or her rights that will transfer to him or her. Again, the age of majority is the legal age established under the state law at which an individual is no longer a minor and, as a young adult, has the right and responsibility to make certain legal choices that adults make. So when we use the term age of majority, we're really referring to when a young person reaches the age where one is legally considered to be an adult. And that ends part 4 of the lecture on IEPs. You can now move to part 5.